Hello and welcome to the Smarten show. My name is Milena Weinberg, and Darryl will be arriving shortly. Here at the Smarten show, we discuss everything to do with parenting, education, and just family, just raising families. We are here live in the on lambnetwork.tv. You can also find us in the School Pods Canada Facebook page and Smarten Up YouTube channel. And there comes Darryl.
Hello. I am here.
All right. So, um, we are very passionate about education, about families being strong, about the next generation being trained up. Our um, the famous quote from the Bible is that we are to train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's older, he will not depart from what he's been trained to do from the foundation that has been laid. We know that both in the United States, Canada, and actually most countries in the world at this point, public education is the mainstream way of how children are being taught, and so obviously with change in political situation, things have changed in the education system, and at some point when those education systems were put together, the idea was to serve families, to create strong societies, to train young people for the economical environment of the country, and to really to represent the culture of the people that make up that country. Um, and for the past few shows, we've been talking about how the education system, the public education system, came about in Canada. I've just really laid the foundation by reading an archive article. It's in an open. Just a second. It is open library. I found an open library, and it's called Sociology of Education in Canada. And we should probably put a link to that just so that everyone can read, because as a homeschooler and as we've been putting pods together in our pod that runs from our home, um, we've been studying Canadian history. And I've confessed many times I've never was somebody who was fascinated by history. You've always been interested in history. But I
have a whole
haven't.
bookcase full of history books.
Yes, behind us, there's a section in our library that is history, which Darryl has enjoyed. I haven't. But now that I'm teaching young people history, because I'm recognizing this is part of the training, that we need to know our history to understand where we are at today and where we're going in the future, because we've spoken about the fact that history tends to be cyclical, tends to repeat itself, especially if we're not aware and learning about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we've been studying the foundation of public education in Canada, I thought, well, we've been going into quite a bit of detail. Probably our listeners, we would be putting, I guess, a link to the article I've been going through. It's really a chapter of a book that has been put on this open library. But I thought, one of the things that hasn't been spoken much about in Canada until recently, I guess, has been the role of education in the Aboriginal community. And it wasn't until recently that it was recognized that the way the Aboriginal people in Canada were treated through education. And it's interesting that education really was used to subjugate the Aboriginal people. It wasn't. I mean, when first British and French came to what is now Canada, to this area, obviously they wanted to take land because they needed the resources of the land, or settle and claim the land. And so actually the French were the ones who were making more alliances with the Aboriginal people. They weren't interested in subjugating them in terms of changing them. They just wanted to benefit from relationships with them.
Right.
But and so there were alliances, and the Aboriginal people were really useful when the French tried to fight the British, who wanted the same land, and so our history is really a showcase of human nature and the aspirations of people. But what I wanted to focus on today is once formal education was established in what is now Canada, um, how did that affect the Aboriginal people? Because I think there's a lesson to be learned from that. Because I mean, how many dictators since Hitler or different dictators in history have been using the system that those dictators have developed in order to try to gain the political power that the previous dictator wanted?
Yeah.
and I guess I'm speaking in a negative connotation here in terms of dictatorship, and it's because I think a lot of people in Canada and the United States are recognizing that our education system is no longer serving us. It's no longer listening to the parents, no longer reflecting the culture of the families, but trying to push it in a direction that it's not the culture of the country. It's kind of like, and everybody's seeing kind of the move towards a global type of citizenship, and but really instability being created, and throwing COVID into the whole picture for a couple of years there. A lot of things about our education system kind of came up to the surface. And I think, though, one of the things that really became prominent is also what was done to the Aboriginal children,
Right.
During that time. Because so a lot of connections are to be made. So I'm just kind of going to start going through the story today of education. So history of Aboriginal education in Canada. So before the Europeans arrived in Canada, in the land that is now Canada, Aboriginal people existed, and they educated their children. They weren't sitting going, we need someone to come here and show us how to educate, because we have no idea how to educate our children. They did. They lived in smaller tribes, so they were elders that were passing on through oral tradition, stories. They were teaching them skills like hunting. A lot of especially in Canada, you have to recognize that only probably the southern edge of Canada is really good farming land.
Yeah.
Most of the land in Canada is not. It's cold.
Well, it's cold and it's very rocky too.
And it's rocky. Yeah, we have really thick rock foundation. What is it called? Tectonic plates and so forth, which makes it stable in terms of seismology, but very difficult in terms of agriculture.
Yeah, well, even when we lived up in Peterborough, which is maybe
Central
I don't know,
Ontario, or
yeah, kind of. It's still
going towards the north. I guess.
it's only Peterborough is only what 50, 60 kilometers north of Lake Ontario, so it's not that far north.
Yeah.
And yet you get up there and it is, I mean, Peter, of course, means rock, little pebble.
Peter and Borough.
And it's extraordinarily rocky and hilly up there. So
naturally we could see that if there was any farming going on, it was mostly from very resilient crops, but there was mostly animal farming.
Yeah.
And so the Aboriginal people before a lot of them are nomadic, and so they relied on hunting and fishing, and especially in this part of the northern part of North America here, and so they had to teach their children those skills.
Yeah,
and so they had a system.
Yeah.
um, to educate their children. And so in arrived the Europeans with their ambition to colonize and so forth. And so um, I guess at first they weren't concerned about the education of the Aboriginal people until I guess the Europeans became more serious about settling here, about forming permanent settlements.
Hmm.
Um, and so between it was in the 1800s, wasn't until the 1800s really that policies about the education of Aboriginal people were starting to be passed in our legislature. I mean, Canada was formed in 1867. That's when the Confederation took place.
Right. So now that you're an official country, it becomes all the more important to really develop a formalized education policy, because the success of a country really depends on the education of its citizens.
Well, absolutely. And especially, the Europeans coming here on this land, they wanted to carry on their culture. I mean, there were some very good things that came from Europe in terms of education and culture and so forth. Um, uh, but what happened is, when the Aboriginal people now were here with their own ways, um, there was now policies had to be passed. So between 1880 and 1980, for about a 100-year period, a large portion of Aboriginal children were removed from their homes and sent to boarding schools. At the time, they were called residential schools. Another name that was used was industrial schools. Now, industrial schools, and I didn't know anything about that because they're more like an American term
Yeah.
because they were and so the model for those residential schools was borrowed partially from European education, but partially from those industrial schools that were developed in the United States.
Hmm.
So children were separated from their family and community. Um, I guess, and I'm just going to mention so Egerton Ryerson, who really set the foundation for public education for the Europeans who were here now settling in Canada.
Yeah.
Um, he didn't implement this, but he pretty much drafted the plan of what to do with education with the Aboriginal people. And see, so he played a significant role in the introduction of the residential schooling system in Canada. In 1847, he presented a report. So that was to the Legislative Assembly, and he recommended um, agricultural training for Aboriginal people, which would now move them from their hunting and gathering type of living or hunting, fishing, and so forth to more agricultural because they wanted the Aboriginal original people also to settle in one place. So because they couldn't move in a territory that was being occupied by the British at this point. So one of the things is that he proposed that that's what the schools for original people would do, and also that religion and manual labor will be taught in those schools. Um, so the purpose of residential schools was to fully assimilate Aboriginal children, and that was an official statement from the politicians in the late 1800s when Canada became Canada. So they decided, okay, now that we're a country, we're going to assimilate the Aboriginal people to our lifestyle and culture.
Right.
And so that's why religion was a big part of the residential schools because that was a big value at the time. Um, so they wanted to fully assimilate the children. And so the model for those residential schools was borrowed from the industrial schools in the US, who were practicing something called aggressive civilization. um, that's the term that was used. And if you read reports and documents from the time, we'll be like, oh, they were so politically incorrect. But that was the way of thinking at the time.
Political correctness is only something that has, really been emphasized over, let's say, the past 30 years or so,
Right.
where people,
But you have to understand at the time that they believed that they were coming and they saw the Aboriginal people as wild people and they needed to be
Yeah,
civilized.
they're backwards. They're savages.
Right. Um, but they did have, that's another thing we've studied in our pod, is that they did have a system of governing themselves, and depending on where they lived and how they had to exist, sometimes the women took a prominent role while the men were going out and hunting. So they had to run the camp and everything that was happening. So they didn't even have an issue with the gender roles because it's whatever was
You
required.
did what was needed.
Yeah. And so this aggressive civilization was really to make the Aboriginal people to accept Christian beliefs.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know, was it Christian? Well, because it was both Protestant and Catholic at the time, were the two major religions, which were not really
Not all that.
symbiotic themselves.
Yeah, but they're not all that different when you think about it
Yeah.
either.
Yeah, and so the other thing is obviously to train Aboriginal people. They wanted to train Aboriginal people into being more European, developing habits and lifestyle and even tastes, like to think more European than the way
Well,
they were.
and again, it goes back to, I think, the model that Alexander the Great set, which is that before that, when land was conquered, you kept your culture, you kept your gods, you just pay tribute to the
Yeah.
the ruling kingdom, and everything will be fine. You just go about life as it were. When Alexander the Great came along, he said that Greek culture was superior to everybody else, and he had a burden for making sure that everybody else had the same opportunity to become enlightened.
Right.
And so the whole system of Hellenization,
Yeah.
which was named after a Greek goddess, the goddess Helena,
Yeah.
and they began to impose Greek culture upon the territories that they conquered. The whole story of Hanukkah is really about that, because Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the ruler, so when Alexander the Great dies, his kingdom is split into four kingdoms that was taken over by each of his generals. And the Seleucids were of the north in Syria, and then the Ptolemies were in the south in Egypt. And Antiochus the Fourth, who called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, or God Manifest, he took over the throne, and he was extremely zealous for imposing Greek culture upon everybody else. And the whole story of Hanukkah is that they were Hellenizing the Jews. And when he went too far and tried to erect a statue of Jupiter in the Jewish temple, that's when the rebellion started, and 3.5 year guerrilla war. And, finally the Greeks are overthrown, and Israel gets its land back. Well, it's kind of the same idea that, then when you have
it's aggressive civilization.
Well, yeah. Well, and it's very much like the U.S. the Manifest Destiny, where this Monroe Doctrine after World War II, but even the Manifest Destiny going way back before that, is this the superiority of U.S. culture. Well, the Catholic Church through the Jesuits, I mean, they had a zealousness for proselytizing people. And when you really begin to do your research on the Jesuits, you know that it had nothing to do with Christianity at all. It was all about the Pope. It was all about, Roman rule. So it was just one empire for another, and this one happened to be a more religious one. But this idea that these savages, these heathen, as they were, these barbarians, needed to be enlightened. And so what we do is we, instead of what the Christian scriptures, with the gospel message, which is you go and make disciples, you proselytize, you share your faith, and for those who are willing, okay, then you bring them in.
Yeah.
What the Jesuits did, and what the Catholics as a rule, and even what the Protestants did, is that they forced those in the territories and the colonies to accept that, and you were going to adopt these things. You're going to have our system of government, and you're going to have our education system and all these other things. We're not really giving you a choice about that or not.
Well, no, and I'm going to continue kind of in my notes. But that's the thing. One thing that the Bible doesn't say is that to force people. It is more to draw them with
Yeah.
gentleness.
When you baptize them, hold on under until they give.
Well, and that's the thing. The Bible emphasizes over and over again that God gives us free will and a
Yeah.
choice. Yes, it's a good thing to share what you believe with people, but the forcing part is nowhere to be seen in the Bible. I don't see it. I don't know if somebody, if and so
Yeah, pick up your Bible, whack people over the head until they smarten up.
yeah. So the thing is yes, people get zealous, but sometimes they kind of misinterpret what their text
You
says.
cannot
And
override people's free will.
yeah.
You cannot force people to believe in something. That is oxymoronic.
Well, but the thing is, it's interesting because the Aboriginal education and what happened with it was paralleling with the development of the public education system for the rest of the settlers here in
Right.
Canada. And so what happened is after the passing of the Education Act, um, just a moment, attendance became mandatory in 1894 for Aboriginal people to attend those schools. And but it's kind of like it was moving like that to even European families. It was becoming more and more of the norm that children would not be homeschooled, but they would be sent to a public school.
Hmm.
And so at around the same time, um, you know, then Aboriginal children, they were mandated to go to schools, and even fines or imprisonment were being threatened to families who refused or failed to offer up their children to those residential
So
schools.
you had essentially truancy officers.
So yeah, so it was a very, very forceful transition. If you're offering something good to people, don't you think that they would willingly accept it? I'm just asking for a friend.
Not all the time, but yeah, I mean, by and large, if you give something that is going to naturally improve people's
Well,
lives.
and that's the thing. This is where it lies: the forceful imposition of religion on the people and the lifestyle that made them not so trusting to know that you wanted to educate their children. There were some good intentions with the education, but there were also and like I said, the politicians in the late 1800s were open about the fact that they were really wanting to assimilate the Aboriginal children, and they felt that the best way is to remove them from the family. Now, listen to that: remove them from the family and train them completely separate in those residential schools. Um,
And so what this implies is that the parents don't know what they're doing and that we have a better way. It's the state that has all the answers to your problems. And if you just simply get out of the way and let us educate you because you're an idiot, you don't know what you're doing. But
or you're
that's
uncivilized enough or
well,
intelligent
whatever,
enough to
yeah,
do
whatever,
it.
label you want to
Yeah.
apply to them. It's this condescending superiority attitude that we know better.
Yeah.
And so look what's going on in
Well,
school boards today.
but this is why I wanted to go over the Aboriginal education in Canada because now we are all in upheaval how they were treated, and we should be because it was wrong the way they were treated. But all the other children are starting to be treated the same way as the Aboriginal people were treated at
Well,
that
what is
time.
the attitude of the school boards toward parents? Like they're even banning them
We
from.
have to vote in legislature now. Several provinces in Canada have had to debate whether the parents have the right to know everything that happens in schools. And we have to now defend parental rights. They are no longer assumed, and they're in debate in legislature in different provinces now. That is
And
what's
you
where
have
we are
and you have
at.
a federal government who is openly saying that if you don't do what they're doing, then you're wrong, you're morally unfit, you're on the wrong side of things.
Well, but even funding is being threatened to be pulled away
Well,
from you.
but that's what
You
the
know,
state always does. The
yes.
state uses the carrot and the stick thing. That if you abide by what we do and you do it our way, we're going to use your tax dollars in order to bribe you, in order to get you to play along. But if you don't, and this is what happened in New Brunswick. So New Brunswick Premier right now, Higgs, is saying that they've defunded abortion clinics. Well, now the federal government is threatening to withhold federal funding to the health system in general for hospitals and stuff like that because they won't fund the killing of babies.
Well, it's considered a basic human right, and many times there've been moral debates. Well, how about the human right of the baby? Like we have two human beings, and it's not such a clear cut thing, but we are digressing into the abortion
No, but
debate,
it's the
right?
same thing. Is that it's this attitude with the state that we know better, and we are going to. Whereas the state is supposed to be serving the people, they are public, not masters. They're called public servants, and yet they are serving not us, but they are serving themselves and their cronies.
Well, a system that is being created to now it's lording over the people
Yeah,
versus serving the people.
exactly. I mean, for Justin Trudeau a couple of years ago to tell those who disagreed with his policies as a fringe minority with undesirable views
Yeah, I mean
when well
that's
over 50% of the entire country, I mean, like it's 70-80% were saying that
so.
they didn't agree with him.
So what happened to political correctness with that statement? But anyway, we are just.
But political correctness is only used in order to demonize the points of view that they don't like, and so it becomes offensive.
And this is why I insisted that we talk about the history of education,
Yes.
because what we're seeing, the trend that happened in the late 1800s, is really coming back, and it's no longer just the Aboriginal children now that are
Mhm.
being involved in this
Now it's every child.
agenda. And so what happened, and how do governments justify that? Well, because they do some things that sound good. So when those residential schools opened up, girls were trained in domestic skills, boys were trained in farming and the trades, which is not a bad thing.
No.
Now, but they already had something. They were trained by their families the way they existed. You see, it's not a bad thing to train them these things, but now that makes them unfit to function in their community. And now they
Because it's not an agrarian society. They are nomadic and they are hunters and gatherers.
Yeah, now some that live in the plains are farmers, but it's a lot different. Their farming is a lot different. But
There are no
anyway,
plains in Ontario, except the ones
well,
that fly
not in
overhead.
Ontario. So that's what I'm saying. Only in
The prairies.
the prairie provinces. Yes. So so and at that point the church did play a big role in the education, because they were being trained, their thinking was being changed, but it wasn't long after those residential schools they started gaining numbers because of the mandatory policy of attendance. And it wasn't long after that that death and illness from poor health conditions started rising up. And so in 1906 was the first time documented that there was an official inspection done of those schools. And it was Dr. Bryce, who at the time, so that was early 1900s. He was a chief medical officer for the Department of Indian Affairs. And so he did examine the schools and the conditions, and he wrote a report, which interestingly enough was buried for quite some time. And it wasn't until 1922, so that was quite some time later, when Dr. Bryce noticed that the health conditions in residential schools were poor. And actually, he noted that in 1906, he noted that some of the Western provinces in the residential schools, the death rate was up to 50%.
Wow.
In some schools. And that report was never heard or seen for
Mhm.
many years. And it was around 1922. So he wrote his first report in 1906.
Mhm.
In 1922, he left his position of chief medical officer for the Department of Indian Affairs, and he ended up
Mhm.
writing a book
Yeah.
about what happened in this residential school. So
Mhm.
while he was serving the government, he was hushed. Like everything he wrote, and when he proposed that something has to be done in those residential schools, nothing was done,
Yeah.
and his reports were buried.
Yeah.
And so he wrote a book, and but in the meantime, mandatory school attendance laws increased the number of students who were attending residential schools in 1920, so around the same time. So he was watching what was happening to those children in residential schools, and he was trying to make a change, but he wasn't successful. So he resigned in the 1920 mark, and ended up making it public as a private voice through writing a book in 1922.
It reminds me of uh, Charlie Charlie Something's War. It was a movie that actually Tom Hanks was in, and what it focused
Charlie
on.
Wilson?
Charlie Wilson's War. That's right.
Yes.
And it was all about the U.S. involvement of helping the Afghanis fight the Soviets back in 1979. And so they helped fund them and everything else, and they sent like over, and this was back in 1979, 1980, over
Right.
$1 billion to help fund this war, to help the Afghanis over, defeat the Soviets and everything else. And so after, and I think they drove the Soviets out back in 89, so it took 10 years. And then after, he says, okay, we need $1 million now to set up schools. And nobody was willing to do anything. So to take $1 billion to fund the military industrial complex so they could
No
produce
big
weapons
deal.
and stuff like that. Hey, well, and this is what they're doing now with Ukraine. This is now what they're doing with Israel. This is they're funding these wars, and so they can get the weapons and stuff like that. And it's our tax dollars that do it. But when it came time to doing something for thousands of the amount that was actually going to help reestablish Afghanistan and help educate them, nobody wanted to fund anything. Why? Because it didn't meet their agenda. And this is the exact same thing. So you're going to round up all the kids, you're going to put them in schools, but when you see that they're dying of typhus and all these other things,
It was
tuberculosis, right?
actually was the biggest one, and even
It's a lung disease.
and there's some suggestion that some of the children was purposefully exposed. Now that's a speculation. That's people who are saying, but anyway, the fact is that at some places, some schools, about 50% of the kids died from illness and those poor conditions.
Right.
And so, but still, the government was saying, "Oh, we're doing good things for the children because we are educating them." Well, further inspections show that actually the education that those schools provided wasn't that great either. The teachers who were put into those schools were not formally trained. So all these
That sounds familiar.
right. So all these things the government was saying that they were doing, they weren't doing.
Yeah, well.
So and this is why it's appalling. But at the same time, we should be learning from this time of history here in Canada what happened to one part of our population, because there's no part of the population that is exempt from that destiny if we let it happen.
Yeah.
Now, the Aboriginal people were forced to surrender their children.
Yeah.
They would be imprisoned and so forth. So,
and there are parallels to what's happening now. That, in essence, if you don't, if you don't send your kids to school, there are places that will arrest you.
right. And so, in those residential schools, I mean, the maximum level of education kids could receive was grade 8. But almost no students received grade 8 education. What ended up, so there were high enrollment of kids, but they were not even functioning at age appropriate grade levels. I'm sorry, but right now in public schools, I work as a tutor for after school. A lot of kids are still not functioning at age appropriate level. Now everybody blames it on COVID, but I think there were reports before COVID that that high school students in Ontario were graduating with literacy level that
Grade 8.
didn't even um,
Allow them to fill out a resume.
allowed to fill a resume, never
Job
mind to
application.
be able yeah, a job application, never mind to fulfill the needs for a job, like a minimum wage job. So I'm sorry, but I'm seeing a lot of parallels what's happening with our education system. Now, are there schools that are good and teachers that are really striving for excellence? Absolutely. But I find that they're the exception
Well,
nowadays.
and they're fewer and farther between. I mean, you have there's a couple of really good movies that were made. One with Hilary Swank. What was that? The Freedom
Yes,
Fighters.
in Teachers College, I had to watch Freedom Writers
Freedom Writers, right?
and Dangerous Minds with
Dan-
Michelle Pfeiffer was
Yeah,
the other one.
two extraordinary movies,
Yeah.
and both of them were based on real life characters, weren't they?
Well, I'm sure. I mean,
Well, Freedom Writers for sure was. That was an
yes,
actual teacher
actually,
they showed
yes,
her.
yes.
I don't know about Dangerous Minds with Michelle Pfeiffer,
Well,
but
but interestingly enough, in Freedom Writers, she had to take history. She had to take the Holocaust
yeah,
to teach those kids in the inner city schools to tell them that you want to belong to gangs. Let me tell you what this.
well, the most badass gang that ever lived in history.
Oh, are we allowed to say that in this on the show?
I
But
think so.
anyway, she said there was a gang that was ruling the whole, like tried to rule the whole world. And she said Hitler was their leader. And so she took the kids to Holocaust Museum. And those kids started, well, first of all, they started connecting to the Jewish kids in the persecution
Well, but she also had them read the Diary of Anne Frank.
and Frank's diary. And so once those children were educated in history and what had happened in history, the kids' eyes opened and they saw what situation they were in right now.
So now tie that back into what's going on with the public schools and libraries now.
Well, and so I was just reading a few months ago that there's a policy that in school libraries that if a book is um, more than 8 years old, it could be removed from the library and it's to be replaced within your
Because it
published
no
book.
longer reflects
The culture and the society.
and the values that are being promoted. Because if you, I mean, I saw a picture on a channel of one of the main universities in the U.S. I don't know if it was Columbia or Yale or whichever one it was, but you went to the bookstore in the school,
Yeah.
and you looked at the religious section, and it was about Judaism. It was all New Age stuff. There wasn't one book in that section that was about classical Judaism, about actually rabbinic Judaism. It was all New Age stuff.
Yeah.
So what we're dealing with here is what? Revisionist history. And those who conquer get to write the history. And so what's happening is we are being conquered from within, from our own government. We have had a silent invasion. We've had people take over who are public masters and not public servants. So what they do is they grab hold of the levers of power. They grab hold of the purse strings. And so they get to make all the rules. They get to use the force of the state to punish us when we don't go along with their agenda, even though it might not be what they promised when they were running for office. And now what's happening is that history is being erased so that you have this explosion of, support for a terrorist organization in the Middle East at the expense of the one democracy there that is actually protecting people's freedom. Because nobody knows what and they've had people walk around and they've had people question, well, do you know what river and what sea? They have no idea. They don't even know what they're protesting.
There's a lot more emotional
Manipulation,
yes, decision making versus, and yes, I'm outraged by residential schools, but we need to look at, okay, so what can be done, what is being done, what is happening today.
Residential schools, I think some of it had to do with good intentions. I think that maybe they truly did see the Aboriginal people as needing to be upgraded and revealed to the truth. And we understand that the gospel is the truth, but the way that they did it was wrong.
Well,
How they treated them in the process was wrong.
aggressive civilization is a term that actually reflects what was done. Aggression of any kind is no good, no matter how good of a system you're trying to bring in.
Yeah.
So, um, so this is where we are, and this is why we need to learn from our history. And it wasn't until the 1950s when there was a political shift towards mainstreaming students or placing them in regular schools that was starting to be discussed about Aboriginal kids. So that is a lot of years of the government doing nothing for the conditions in these schools.
That's 100 years, basically.
Yes, yes. And so
Wow. That's remarkable.
it is. It absolutely is, because the politicians at the time believed in the cause so much that they were willing to overlook the things that weren't working well, and basic human rights were being taken. Now, that kind of also parallels with the fact that, the 13 colonies in the US that fought for their independence from British rule and taxation. So they became independent. They fought for independence, but then what happened is slavery of Black people was still okay. So we have a little bit of um I don't know, one way to say is oxymoron here. They're fighting for freedom, and so that's why we had to now have the Underground Railroad to Canada, and all these slaves were coming here because in Canada we didn't have that. But then we were treating our Aboriginal people very poorly. So, you know, we have to really look at things objectively instead of, um, I, you know, there's a term nowadays, it's called virtue signaling.
Yeah.
Though we want to achieve some great things, we have to really look at history and see how we are affecting the people. So here's what I'm reading from the 1950s political shift. So noted the residential schools began to take a child welfare purpose in the era. So children who required institutional care for social or family reasons would be admitted to residential schools. So now they were trying to say, well, you know, um, let's change the residential schools, not so much about education, but let's make it a place where the kids could um, be taken care of. But you know why there's this shift? Because, but like we just said, almost 100 years they were treated poorly. Kids were ripped out of their families. So now there's generations of Aboriginal people who are devastated. Now they have mental health needs in the community.
The level of addictions and suicide on reservations and stuff like that is
So here comes
multiple times the national average.
So here comes the government to the rescue to turn those residential schools into child welfare purpose, and children who required institutional care for social family reasons would be admitted to residential schools. More day schools were also opened on reserves, which resulted in a significant increase in the number of Aboriginal children attending. But what have you done? You've destroyed now the Aboriginal communities. Now they can't exist on their own. Now you want to save them, but it's not by bringing them back to their roots
and empowering them and teaching them how to work
but
the
it's
land.
just bringing more schools into the reservation, into the reserves where they are. And so children were attending provincially run schools. In 1970, the National Indian Brotherhood called for an end to federal control for Aboriginal schooling, and residential schools eventually began to close. That is in 1970. That is 100 years. How many? That's a couple generations at least of destroying the Aboriginal community.
Well, that's about 4 or 5 generations of school children.
Right. So at that point in the 1970s, the residential schools started closing, and the children on the reserves were educated on reserve schools, which have their own unique set of problems, and that they say it's going to be discussed at another place. So in total, let's scroll down a little bit. So what resulted um, in between the late 1800s until 1900s, um, until the abolition of residential schools, about one third of the Aboriginal children were placed in residential schools, often for a large portion of their childhood. So now you have breakdown of family. They didn't know their families. As a matter of fact, the residential schools were built far away from reserves.
so that they couldn't have any contact with their parents.
Even if they tried to escape, it would have been a difficult thing to get back to home. So much of what was taught in residential schools were based upon the assumption that their own cultures were not worth preserving and knowing. So
Mhm.
trauma of being separated from parents, siblings, with the prison-like conditions, and we were talking about death rates were staggering. Can you imagine all these kids seeing all these young children being sick, their
Mhm.
friends, and dying? I mean, that's trauma on its own. Um,
Children were forbidden to speak their mother tongue, which further entrenched the idea that Aboriginal cultures were worthy only of shame.
yeah. So, yes. So at this point, the Aboriginal community needs help. They need to be restored.
And it's learned helplessness that you are
Yeah.
completely dependent upon. And this is what, back in the United States, Ulysses Grant, um, after the Civil War, he, passed legislation. He passed a bill that said that all natives have to be on reservations by a certain time, or they were going to be considered hostile. And they were going to be, and there were thousands upon thousands. It was called the Indian Wars, and there were thousands upon thousands of Aboriginals that were killed for simply not going to the prisons that the federal government imposed. I mean, it's utterly shameful
Well,
how these people were treated.
well, absolutely. And so, the next paragraph talks about the damage of residential schools that the children, not while they were there, but when they left, there was PTSD because there was physical abuse, sexual abuse, there was
Mhm.
all kinds of stuff that was happening. So here you are, you're trying to civilize children. Meanwhile, you're completely destroying them.
Yeah.
And so how could, like, everybody knows that when a child is traumatized, they can't learn anything academic or anything of lasting.
Yeah.
They're in survival mode at that point. And so um and I want to parallel this with what's happening in public schools now. There are more um they're more physical. um you know, I was just talking actually even yesterday to a teacher. She's just fresh out of teachers college. She's supply teaching for a school board. And so we asked her, so how is it going? And she's like, oh, some days are better than others. And then she said, oh, well, one of the students hit a teacher in the school. That's unacceptable. And I'm thinking, I have had a friend who's been physically, you know, hurt by a student. And that wasn't even a high school student, it was like a middle school
It's
student,
grade 7.
a 6 or 7. Um, so violence in the schools is increasing. So guess what? I don't care what beautiful academic programs we are going to implement in our schools until we take care of the conditions in our schools.
Mhm.
And until there is some kind of rule, some kind of, what we talked about, there's no longer consequences to the violence that happens in the
And
schools.
that's very intentional, is that it's being allowed in order to create chaos, in order to break down the order of things. Because when society turns in on itself and you turn people against each other by promoting violence, and this is what's going on in the US right now. You've got all these, what they call woke DAs, that are being funded by the World Economic Forum and George Soros and his Open Society Foundation. Is that they're soft on crime. They continue to release criminals back into the system. The police are essentially neutered. They're not allowed to enforce law, whether they know it or not. You've got pro Hamas demonstrations that are going on, pro Palestinian demonstrations that are going on, and the police are being told you're not allowed to do anything about this.
Well, there's all kinds of things that are happening on the streets of, like, even here within Ontario, and police are not doing much. But so just going back to schools, though, there is. I mean, I know teachers are making reports for abusive behavior by students and things like that, and so speaking further with this teacher, she says nothing is being done. There's
Nope.
no follow up. There's nothing. Just like that medical
Well,
report
it's
about,
why you left the school board 13 years
absolutely,
ago.
and just like that medical report on residential schools that the conditions were atrocious, that was just buried.
Yeah.
And so the reason we started School Pods Canada is because, first of all, we want to empower parents to understand that they care and they know what is best for their children, and they need to speak up, and they also need to make choices. And if they find that the school, I mean, I'm sorry to say, but a lot of the families that come to School Pods Canada is because there's been like education caused trauma
Mhm.
in the children. And so we have to, like, I can't even start teaching them academics until we help them relax in the environment, in the small group environment. And so um I think I'm reading about the damage done by residential schools, and I'm thinking, well, our schools nowadays are, the damage to the children is on the rise.
Mhm.
So we're here to caution parents to be involved. Homeschooling is wonderful, but we know that now a lot of parents have been financially enslaved by credit and inflation and things that are happening, job loss during COVID.
And so here's what has to
Yes,
happen.
yes.
We are having we're being forced to create alternative systems outside of the existing structures, and that involves every single element of society. Education. This is why we've started School Pods Canada. We need there was a Jewish lady who posted on, I think, X last week, and said, from Toronto, who said that there is pro-Palestinian propaganda that is being taught in the classrooms. It was challenged, and the school board said it was perfectly legitimate. There's nothing wrong with it.
Well,
And
we have Jewish friends who, it was the bus
it was a
driver.
bus driver,
It wasn't the bus driver herself, but it was the child, her child, and was speaking against Israel,
10 years old or something like that.
and so when those two Jewish kids on the bus complained, they were told that they need to go to another bus route so they're not with that bus driver.
Instead of there being consequences. And
To and so um and again, the news in Toronto just recently, a private Jewish school, there was shooting. Now, it was done at a time nobody would be there. That was just an intimidation tactic, but that is being done. So
and the police aren't even revealing what the footage was.
until our society um, decides to move towards healthy relations, and until the division in our society stops, I don't believe public schools are going to get any better, because public schools are really a playground for political agenda, and so um, yes, education happens, but it's mixed with a lot of things that are really not helpful. So we
Yeah.
are going to wrap up at this point. We don't want to alarm families, but you know what? You do have the power to come together in your community. And if you don't know how, just contact School Pods Canada, and we'll talk to you how to start pods where the interest of the family is in the forefront.
Yeah. So we want to thank you once again for joining us here on Smarten Up Show on lambnetwork.tv. Make sure you give us a like and a share, and go to lambnetwork.tv and find out some of the other great programming that's on there. We've got some phenomenal stuff that will help you break through this cycle of deception and lead you into truth. So have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you here next week, same time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
If you missed today's show or want to watch it again, or want to tell someone where they can watch this episode, go to lamnetwork.tv, where you can find this show and all the other live Lamb Show archives in the on-demand section of the website. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to tell someone about the Messianic Lamb Network. We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussions, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take a tour of the lamnetwork.tv website. I'm Darryl Weinberg, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.